We got the greatest rap video that's ever been.
Today's lesson, cellular respiration, the latest energy generating sensation.
Welcome to another virtual biology lecture. Today we're going to be discussing photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Hope you guys enjoy and don't forget to take good notes. Today's virtual lecture's objective is to become familiar with the following assessment standards from reporting category 1 and 4, which are going to be tested in the STAR Biology EOC. At the end of the lecture, you should be able to explain and compare cellular processes such as photosynthesis and cellular respiration. All living things need a source of energy to carry out life processes, such as movement, reproduction, growth, and response. This is why all organisms need to take in or produce nutrients to supply that energy that's going to be needed in order for them to carry out those life processes. Plants make their food for themselves and for other organisms when they eat them. Now, algae, on the other hand, often fills this role in aquatic ecosystems. Organisms that make their own food are called autotrophs, or producers, such as algae, blue-green bacteria, plants, and some prokaryotes. Now, the organisms that cannot make their own food are called heterotrophs, or consumers, such as animals, fungi, some bacteria, and some protists. Okay, so now let's take a closer look at autotrophs. As we mentioned, autotrophs produce their own food, but there's basically two types of autotrophs. There's photosynthetic and chemosynthetic. Let's start with the photosynthetic, which are the organisms that obtain the energy directly from sunlight and then convert this light energy into chemical energy through a chemical reaction known as photosynthesis. So how does this happen? Well, plants, for instance, during photosynthesis take in water and carbon dioxide from their environment and use these materials along with light energy to produce sugar and oxygen. But where in the plant does it do this and how? Okay, so let's start by looking at the reactants photosynthesis needs and where these are obtained. So let's look at a leaf on a plant. Now, most of you, when you look at leaves, have probably noticed the veins running across the leaves, which are used to transport water to all of the cells on the leaf. But if we were to look even closer, we would see a waxy coating that even looks shiny, which is made up of lipids, and we call this coat the cuticle. Based on our previous lectures and our knowledge of lipids, we know that this biomolecule repels water. So why would leaves want to repel water if photosynthesis needs it as a reactant? Well, it's actually meant to conserve water within the leaves of the plant. And it also helps when it rains so that the water slides off the leaves and falls onto the roots, which are what absorb the water and transport and distribute it appropriately to all of the parts of the plant by using the stem and the veins. Okay, so that's one of the reactants for photosynthesis. What about CO2? Where is this gas obtained? Well, if we look at the next layer on the leaf by looking at it even closer, we will be able to see the epidermal layer of the leaf, which contains epidermal plant cells. Now, these cells are important because they are the outer layer of cells on a leaf. Now, this layer has very important specialized cells called guard cells, which is, as you can see in this image, are guarding an opening called the stoma or stomata, which represents many. Now, these openings are responsible for the exchange of gases in which CO2, the reactant needed for photosynthesis, is allowed to enter the inner cell layers of the leaf. And then at the end of photosynthesis, when O2 is produced, it is then released through this opening. So why are these cells so special and even called specialized cells? Well, these cells actually control when stomata is opened or closed. Guard cells do this by allowing their vacuoles to become enlarged with water intake, causing the cell to bloat and curve, causing the stomata to open. Now, the reverse is seen as well when these guard cells allow water to be released from their vacuoles, causing the cells to revert back to their normal shape and close the stomata. So if we were to see this epidermal layer of a leaf under the microscope, we would be able to see these guard cells such as these, and the stomata would be found in between them. Now, it's important that you notice that the epidermal layer is both at the top of the leaf and at the bottom, which means stomata is found on both sides of the leaf. Okay, so what about the inner layers of the leaf? Well, if we were to fillet the leaf, we would see all of the inner cell layers called mesophyll layers, which are composed of plant cells with a lot of chloroplasts. So why is this important? Well, chloroplast is the primary location in which the process of photosynthesis takes place. Now, we said that plants gather the energy from sunlight, but how? Well, it does this with the use of light-absorbing pigments found in chloroplasts, such as chlorophyll, which is the primary pigment involved in photosynthesis. Now, chlorophyll absorbs mostly blue and red light, and it reflects green and yellow light, which reaches our eyes. This is why plants look green to us. So, why is this important? Well, when a substance absorbs light, it is also absorbing the energy of that light. Chlorophyll is located in the thylakoids found in the chloroplast of each plant cell. This is why mesophyll cells tend to have a lot of chloroplasts so that they can absorb this light energy and it can be used for photosynthesis. Okay, so let's see how does photosynthesis work. Overall, photosynthesis takes place in two stages in the chloroplast. The first is the light-dependent stage, which happens in the thylakoid membrane. This is where light strikes chlorophyll and it is then converted into energy carriers known as ATP. Now, we've mentioned ATP before, but we've just simply said that it's a form of energy. But what does ATP stand for? ATP means adenosine triphosphate because the molecule is made up of adenine and 3 phosphates. Basically, it's an adenosine nucleotide with 2 extra phosphates, as you can see here. Overall, the light-dependent stage needs both light energy and water, which results into ATP as well as O2, as seen here in the products. Now, we mentioned before that O2 is released through stomata, and you need to keep in mind that ATP will be needed for the second stage, which is called the light-independent stage. In other words, no light required. And it's also known as the Calvin cycle. Now, the Calvin cycle takes place in the inner space of the chloroplast. This stage can actually occur in the dark, which is why it's called the light-independent stage. But it does need the ATP product from the light-dependent reaction. Overall, in this stage, 6 carbon dioxide molecules and ATP are used to form only one 6-carbon sugar known as glucose. So why do plants want glucose made? Well, plants use this sugar molecule to build more complex carbohydrates, which can be used for growth and development. Plants also use this energy stored in sugar molecules when needed through the process known as cellular respiration, which we're going to discuss later in this video. Okay, so let's take an overall look at photosynthesis with the following equation. As you can see, the reactants are 6 water molecules, 6 carbon dioxide molecules, which are fueled by the absorption of light energy, and they produce 6 O2 molecules and only 1 glucose molecule. Notice, from the chemical formula for glucose, you can see that it's a 6-carbon sugar, and you should by now be able to recognize it by its hexagon shape. But you will also need to recognize it from its chemical formula as seen here, which is C6H12O6. Now, it's important to note that not all autotrophs use sunlight to make their food. Some use the energy in inorganic compounds instead of sunlight in a process called chemosynthesis. Now, bacteria, for instance, found near hydrothermal vents absorb hydrogen sulfide and carbon dioxide from the vent water and use the seawater as a source of oxygen. Bacteria actually use energy released by oxidizing sulfur to make organic molecules, similar to how plants make glucose, an organic molecule, with the energy from the sunlight. Okay, now that we have a good understanding of what autotrophs are and how they produce their own nutrients to supply energy, let's look at these organisms that cannot produce their own nutrients. Where do these organisms get energy from? Well, these organisms are known as heterotrophs, and they must consume food in order to release the energy stored in food as ATP, which is used in the cell. Now, this is accomplished through a process known as cellular respiration. Overall, cellular respiration takes place in 2 distinct cellular environments. The first is known as anaerobic, where there is no oxygen present, and it takes place in the eukaryotic cell's cytoplasm. The second is known as aerobic, where oxygen is present, and this one takes place in the mitochondria. So let's first go over the first stage of cellular respiration. As we mentioned, it takes place in the cytoplasm and no oxygen is present, so there's no oxygen needed in this process. This process is known as glycolysis. Glycolysis basically breaks down a 6-carbon sugar known as glucose into a 3-carbon molecule. So in other words, you're getting a glucose and you're breaking it in half into these 2 molecules. Now, when this happens, ATP is released. At the end of glycolysis, an overall net release of 2 ATP molecules for the cell to use is going to be seen. Now, some of you might be thinking, but I see a total of 4 ATPs. Well, the reason that we say overall net is because we invested at the beginning 2 ATPs. So in reality, we only profited 2 ATPs overall. Okay, so this is where the big decision needs to be made. What's next after glycolysis? And it all depends on oxygen, whether or not oxygen is available for the cells to use. If it's not available, then we continue with the rest of this process as anaerobic conditions, meaning no oxygen present. And we call this next process fermentation. Now, there are two types of fermentation. The first one is lactic acid fermentation, and it's called that way because it produces lactic acid. So you may be thinking, well, what is lactic acid? Well, we've all experienced this in our lives once or twice before. This is the effect of lactic acid buildup, especially when you haven't worked out in a long time and then all of a sudden you decide to work out and you start to feel your muscles getting very sore the next days. Well, that soreness is coming from lactic acid buildup. Now, this happens when you're causing your muscle cells to use a lot of energy to exercise, and those muscle cells are not used to it. So that means that they're not prepared and they don't have the oxygen that's going to be needed to get that energy. So what happens is they start to get overworked. They require more oxygen. They don't have it, so they have to go through fermentation right after glycolysis. And that fermentation ends up making lactic acid, and you build up lactic acid, which causes your muscles to get sore. The other type of fermentation is known as alcohol fermentation, which produces ethanol and CO2. Now, yeast cells use this process, and we make use of this when we make bread or alcohol. Take bread in the oven, for example. The reason it rises and forms those fluffy, spongy gaps inside is because the CO2 being released is from the alcohol fermentation. Now, some of you may be thinking, what? My bread has alcohol? Not exactly, because the small amounts of alcohol that is produced is actually evaporated as the bread bakes. Okay, remember these processes take place only when there is no oxygen present in the cells, also known as anaerobic respiration. But what if there were oxygen available at the end of glycolysis? What would that look like? So let's take a look at aerobic respiration. And where does this take place? Well, aerobic respiration follows glycolysis taking place at the mitochondria only if oxygen is available. So what is the mitochondria? Well, the mitochondria is an organelle found in eukaryotic cells, which means animal and plant cells. Okay, so what exactly is happening in the mitochondria? Well, there's two steps in aerobic respiration, which both take place in the mitochondria. Now, the first one is called the Krebs cycle, also known as the citric cycle, which is where the 3 carbon sugars known as pyruvate or pyruvic acid that were produced in glycolysis are actually going to be used to further release more ATP. Now, this is also going to cause CO2 to be released as well. Okay, then in the second step, this is actually called the electron transport chain. And this is also taking place in the mitochondria, but specifically in the inner membranes of the mitochondria. And this is where oxygen is actually going to be required. And H2O is also released here. Now, at the end of aerobic respiration, an additional 34 ATP molecules are actually released. This is why this part of cellular respiration is known as the most energy profitable component. Now, in total, cellular respiration can possibly give 36 ATP molecules from just one single glucose molecule. Overall, it can be summarized best with this equation, in which one glucose molecule plus 6 O2 molecules end up producing 6 CO2 molecules and 6 H2O molecules with a total of 36 ATP energy-containing molecules. Let's take a look at the big picture. What have we learned? Well, we know that photosynthesis takes place in the chloroplast of plant cells, and cellular respiration takes place in the mitochondria of eukaryotic cells. So you need to make sure that you realize that the mitochondria is found both in animal and in plant cells, meaning both plant and animal cells go through the process of cellular respiration, unlike photosynthesis, which only plant cells can go through photosynthesis because animal cells do not have chloroplasts. Okay, what else do we know? Well, we know that photosynthesis requires sunlight. Therefore, it must start its light-dependent stage when there is sunlight present. And as for cellular respiration, this can actually happen at any point in time that the cell requires ATP to be released. Okay, what else do we know about these? Well, we know both of the equations seen for photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And if you notice, the reactants for photosynthesis, carbon dioxide and water, are actually the products for cellular respiration. And the products for photosynthesis, glucose and oxygen, are the reactants for cellular respiration. So as you can see, both reactions need each other. They form a cycle in which one process stores energy into food, and the other process releases that energy from food in the form of ATP. Okay, now that we've gone over cellular processes such as photosynthesis and cellular respiration, you should be familiar with the following assessment standards from reporting category 1 and 4. Alright, this concludes our virtual biology lecture on photosynthesis and cellular respiration. I hope you all took great notes and wrote down any questions or concerns that you may have so that we can discuss them in class. Well, that's it. Have a great one.
Using monosaccharides for energy production to power each cell's metabolic function.
Respiration is what keeps you alive.